Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to preface my presentation today with a couple of observations. One, wherever I go in the world, I'm always asked why the UK higher education system is so in love with the political economy of neoliberalism and why we have failed to resist it. Two, whenever I go anywhere in the world, I'm asked to elaborate the political economy of neoliberalism, and as soon as I do, people collapse into despair and depression and misery and kind of blame me for making them feel bad. So I would like to start off today by asking us a few questions. I noticed that there is a very potent, effective ecology of deconstruction. And it's very easy to get accused of just laying on the misery and the grievance studies. And I'd like to invoke Sara Ahmed at this point and just remind us that as soon as we name the problem, we become the problem. And I would also invite us as a collective of scholars, researchers, practitioners in higher education to raise a few questions. So how do we analyse the political economy of neoliberalism without activating misery narratives? How do we acknowledge and celebrate resistance without relying on this compliance critique binary? And thirdly, how can we start to imagine a post-neoliberal, and dare I say post-gender, university? What is this business about neoliberalism? Where does it come from? Who imagined it? Who dreamt this up? Well, I'm aware that the term itself has come up for lots of criticism, never mind its functionalities. So, for example, it's been described as a linguistic omnivore. It's like this monstrous machine that gets blamed for every ill, every difficulty, every challenge in our political systems. It's become anthropomorphized, and it's in danger of kind of conceptual aggregation. Now, I'm conscious that it migrates, it mutates, it manifests itself differently in different parts of the world, in different organizations, in different communities. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to just look at three aspects. First, that it's part of the late capitalist economy, and it's very much linked to deregulation and the markets. Secondly, it's globally circulating cluster of policy measures, for example, privatization. And thirdly, which I think is extremely important, is that it is a cultural regime. It's a governing rationality that privileges price and profit. So, for example, the new terms that are coming into the debate are like Uberization, unbundling, the gig economy. Let's do everything on the cheap. Let's maximize the profit and treat the global labor force as a disposable. Now, another question I get asked is, how did it get in there? How did it get entangled with higher education in Britain? We constantly get exceptionalized in Britain. And I've tried to theorize this. And one view is that I think it's so obvious to all of us here are about the material interventions. When I was working in Sweden, they used to say, why don't you just say no to all of this? Well, we can't, because if we say no, we're out of the running, we're out of the game. So funding is a very primary aspect of neoliberalism. If you don't engage with the indicators and the dominant narratives, you're out. Audit, of course, has very condensed notions of what constitutes quality. And just to invoke Judith Butler, what norms are used to evaluate quality, and who is determining those norms? Which social groups are determining the norms of quality? Now, employment regimes are getting a lot of coverage about the precariat, about pay, the gender pay gap, the vice-chancellor's pay, etc. These are all very, very important material considerations. But there are other issues as well here that are linked to epistemic hierarchies. The more senior you get, the more opportunity you have to control knowledge creation, production, dissemination, etc. And it's no mistake here when we look at the underrepresentation of marginalized groups in the knowledge industry as knowledge producers, very good as knowledge transmitters, but fewer opportunities to create and exchange knowledge. Then, of course, there's the discursive. There's a whole set of what's known as truth-telling. I'm sure many of you who are working in the UK are involved in this, either as a truth teller or somebody who's being told the truth about your publications, your promotion prospects, etc. We have peer review, we have impact, we have appraisal, we have these search agencies, often known as headhunters. And I made the mistake of using that term when I was doing a public lecture in Borneo, and it created absolute havoc and confusion. But also there's this the esteem and reputation, and people will invest huge amounts of resource in enhancing and maintaining reputation. But there's also the Thatcherian closure, the TINA. There is no alternative. The closure of the political universe. You do it this way, or you don't do it at all. And then there's this performative repetition, and again to invoke Judith Butler. How does power operate? It operates invariably through endless repetitions. So the same messages permeate the whole system. What counts? What values? What is of importance? And this notion that reputation isn't just about pride, it's about money. It has a market value. But what I've also noticed, in addition to the material and the discursive, is there is a potent, effective economy at work. Neoliberalism works on people's emotions, our feelings, our anxieties. There's a manic drive for individual, for organizational, and national distinction and differentiation. And this is often catalyzed through crisis discourse. Just have a look at some of the metaphors that are being used in higher education studies. Avalanche is coming. A tsunami is coming. We were told recently by our Vice-Chancellor, winter is coming. So yes, well, it was October at the time, but never mind. So there's this kind of catastrophizing that's operating. And we're looking at, in CHEER, at internationalization at the moment, and the policy texts are full of this anxiety, FOMO. If we don't do this, FOMO, fear of missing out. If we don't do this, we're going to get left behind. India's going to take over. China's going to take all the students, etc. So there's this desperate need to catch up and to stay ahead of the game. And what happens is you get sort of effective contagion, circulation. I don't know if any of you are involved in the REF, but as soon as you walk into a meeting about it, you can feel it. Everybody's so anxious, so worried about the return, about the time, about who's going to be returned, is it good enough, etc. What are the competitors doing? And it is contagious. People get sucked up, they get caught up in it. And then there are a whole range of emotions that are provoked, invoked, stimulated by neoliberalism. And I think shame plays a very major part. We are made to feel shamed. We have spreadsheets circulating with every single grant application we make, and then a little column with those that were accepted and those that were rejected. And everybody can see your failure, your shame. We're also invited to shame others, to mentor colleagues and tell them that they're research inactive, they're not productive enough, their publications aren't high enough quality, etc. So shame is a very important relational intervention. There's guilt, but then there's also pride. And let's not forget that neoliberalism, as well as being material, it is discursive. So it has creative and it has oppressive implications. So a lot of people feel very proud by their success within the indicators. But very importantly, it operates on desire. It makes us want what is good for the economy. And that is important for the happiness formula, as Sarah Ahmed would say. We will be happy when we do it right and we get the approval. And a question I'd like to raise is, how do all these emotions interact with structures of equality? Are some social groups more easily shamed than others, particularly those who don't have the entitlement to be there in the first place? And it's no surprise that that term, that concept, the imposter syndrome, has come back into circulation. Even Michelle Obama this week mentioned it when she was speaking in London. So, there's a trial. We're permanently on trial by public exposure. In the past, in-house matters were kept private. Now, I'm not going to do golden ageism. There was a huge amount wrong with the past, but in the past, it wasn't so in the public domain. So now the league tables, the scores, etc., all of these are out there for everybody to see. And this is producing a very, very powerful binary of success and failure narratives. Again, at individual, at organizational, at national level. There are the winners, and then there are the losers. And the losers are kept on precarious, disposable contracts, and the winners seem to be there forever. But one of the problems that I see is, because we are so measured against each other, this competition erodes solidarity. We very rarely speak as one community because it's actually in our interest to be pejorative about the other. So neoliberalism cultivates and optimizes, but it also disparages difference. So if you are a loser, it's your fault. It's because you don't have the right strategies, the right self-management, care, etc. It's your fault. And if you're a winner, it's because it's your competence and skills. So, again, how does all this happen in academia? Well, colleagues like Carol Leithwood, Valerie Hay have written beautifully about passionate attachment. There's a huge amount of pleasure involved in intellectual work, and that keeps us hooked in. We put up with all these minor, quotidian irritations because we feel so attached to our intellectual projects. So, there are rewards and there are injuries in the neoliberal economy, which makes it extremely difficult to mobilize against. So some provocations then. And this comes from decades of research. But neoliberal intellectual culture appears to be making academic labor and activity and productivity intelligible via dominant metrics and norms. It's eroding counter-hegemonic knowledge. It's getting increasingly difficult to get funding for anything that isn't linked to dominant policy narratives. And that's not just in Britain. If you look worldwide, what's happening to gender studies, for example, it's being eroded, it's being closed down. It's reducing leadership to amplification of dominant messaging systems. And a major question that's come out from so much of my research on women in leadership is it possible within a neoliberal system to lead differently? Can you lead as a feminist? Can you influence if you have different values? Or is all leadership a sign-up to the neoliberal project? It's creating and it's promoting a whole range of ontological antagonisms. There's a massive dissonance for many people, whether they're students, staff, professional services, etc., between what they believe, their value systems, and what they have to perform on a daily basis. There's been a massive reevaluating of value. And in a market calculus, a big question is, what is not measured? For example, gender equality. Go back to those league tables. Some of the universities that have been persistently and consistently at the top of the league tables have some of the worst record for gender equality. So it's not seen as an indicator of quality. And quality and equality continue to develop on completely separate trajectories. And many institutions have a strategic plan, and then they have an equality plan. And there's no integration of the different areas. Now let's go back to Sweden. We used to have coffee there, fika, every day. We used to sit and talk, and they asked me every day, how is it you've accepted stuff like the impact agenda in Britain? You know, we would not accept that in Sweden. We are researchers, we're not journalists. So I would say, well, actually, you have been neoliberalised in Sweden, you just haven't seen it, because it's often introduced by stealth. And as Wendy Brown would say, neoliberalism is generally more termite-like than lion-like. It kind of gets in there under the surface. You don't always see it. You can feel it, but you don't always see it. It's to use the Foucauldian concept of capillary power. It's everywhere and nowhere. It's very slippery. It's very quixotic. It's very abstract. And we regulate ourselves. We worry about our next publication. We worry about our next grant. We worry about meeting the indicators. I mentor a lot of staff at Sussex and beyond, and it's a constant narrative of anxiety. As soon as they enter my office, it's, oh my God, I haven't got any research funding, and I'm really bad. And this is the tone. This is the tone. It's all about what the deficit, the lack, what you need to be doing differently. We monetarize desires, and we desire what is monetarized. And I hear colleagues saying, oh, I'm really desperate to get that 3 million big, large grant, whatever, etc. And there's almost kind of like a libidinous engagement with it. And then there's the Vera Lynn type stuff. And some of you will probably be too young to know what on earth I'm talking about, but this, you know, the war effort, the sacrifice, the austerity, we're all in it together. We keep being told we have to generate more income on one level, and then on the other level we're being told our vice-chancellors are earning $500,000, they're flying around the world first class, staying in 8-star accommodation, etc. But the university is about to collapse if we don't get more research income. So it's almost kind of like a bordello logic here, which I'm very sceptical about. And then there's the Bordosian notion of illusio, the game, playing the game. And some people are very invigorated and excited by the neoliberal game. They love it. It's like playing chess or something. You know, they love being strategic and decoding and working out how they can get one over on that one down the road, etc. So it's a very complex assemblage of discursive, symbolic, and material rewards for those who are servile to the priorities of the market. And the winners are doing very well indeed. Now, another explanation for our failure to resist is this notion of the accelerated academy. And I came across this lovely term by Mark Carrigan of cognitive triage. So every day when we open our inbox and we have 300 emails to answer, that takes up all our attention, all our resource. And we think, well, we'll just finish this, and then we'll think about the bigger issues. We'll just fill in this 10th form this week asking about our research impact, and then we'll actually get to do our research. So everything gets delayed because we are pushed with so many urgent matters. But there's another area as well, that often capitalism masquerades as democratization. So, for example, there's been a major form of linguistic hijacking. So some of the terms, like the terms that are being used today and throughout the conference, of inclusion, excellence, etc., words like diversity, choice, they have been appropriated by the neoliberal project. They've been evacuated of their political meanings. They've been neutralized. They've been marketized. They've been politicized. There are consultants now who make hundreds of thousands of pounds a day advising on diversity, for example. It's become a big industry and absolutely evacuated of its radical roots. So universities then, are they cultivating this populist approach? The choice discourse is very much part of neoliberalism and has been for decades in schools, in universities, throughout the public sector. This notion somehow that the consumer is getting empowered by calling institutions more to account. This reliance on customer satisfaction surveys is also very much part of the landscape. But it's also encouraging micro-entrepreneurs. So anybody now who relies on the state is seen as a complete loser. It's all about your individual entrepreneurship. And the digital revolution, which on one hand looks very inclusive, enhancing the reach, getting more people to participate, etc. But on the other hand, it's another form of marketization. And what's interesting, I was speaking a couple of weeks ago at a conference in London on hard-to-reach populations and widening participation. And the Mandarins were all there from the Office for Students. The whole WP movement seemed to have been reduced to a technology. People were told they have to get more ambitious strategic plans. They have to go for much, much more ambitious targets and outcomes. There was no discussion about why these hard-to-reach groups might want to enter the university, might want to create knowledge, but have their identities recast as knowledge producers rather than just consumers, how the knowledge that created might work towards the development of those communities, for example. There was no discussion about that. It was all about targets, strategies, and outcomes. So, as Will Davis was saying, there's a kind of virility culture here, a governing through unhappiness. Let's heat up the floor to see who can keep hopping the longest. And if you collapse with stress and exhaustion and burnout, it's because you're a loser. So, how do we deal with all these weak people in higher education, these burdens? Well, we have resilience training at a cost, again, of thousands. And part of the resilience discourse is that we have to embrace danger and precarity and austerity. It's inevitable. And if you have the right self-management strategies, you can ride it. You know, bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. I'll deal with it. So what is now required is plasticity, adaptability. So instead of challenging, we twist, we contort, we contrive. How do we fit? Every time a new indicator is introduced, we have all the follow-up training and professional development. So nobody says, why are we doing the impact agenda? The question usually is, how do we respond rather than the signification? How do we sign up for the next course that tells us how to speak to politicians and how to lobby, etc.? So we spend a lot of time trying to upskill ourselves so we can meet the indicators rather than throwing the indicators back. But what's interesting is that there are a whole lot of unhealthy practices that are encouraged in the political economy of neoliberalism. Narcissism is one, and this is very encouraged in the impact agenda. You have to boast, you have to be so vulgar and self-promote, you have to kind of thrust your research in the faces of ministers, community organizations, the lot. You have to, there has to be such attribution. It's almost kind of solipsistic. You know, it's my research changed that policy. It was me, it was all down to me. Not my team, or not my university, it was me. And this relentless self-promotion, which invariably means a lot of competition and disparagement of the other. So we have all these unhealthy practices, but at the same time, we have all this absolute panic, moral panic about mental health crisis in higher education. And a lot of money is now being made available. And colleagues at Paul and Yasser in Cheer are doing some great work looking at mental health and doctoral scholarship. But what's happening here is that it's getting reduced to technologies of self-management. Go on a mindfulness course, embrace positivity, learn to manage yourself differently, manage your time differently, get some hobbies, etc. And all of this is introducing and reinforcing these concepts of fragility and vulnerability. So it's all about individual strategies. And I'm asking whether these are massive, massive distractions from policy failures. We're keeping people very insecure, very fearful, at different levels. We're telling them they have no future, or if they want a future, they've got to earn it themselves, and it might not last for long. We're telling people, I can't even bear to watch Brexit news anymore because it just sucks all the energy out of me. We're telling people that the employment futures are very, very difficult. People are going to leave university with masses of debt, which they will never be able to repay. We're constantly frightening people and then berating them for having mental health problems. Okay, so while we are worrying ourselves senseless about the TEF, the REF, whether our publications are 3 stars or 4 stars, whether our case study is going to be submitted, whether the politicians have had their whole consciousness realigned as a result of our research, around the globe, a lot of scholars are at risk. And while globalization is a massive part of neoliberalism, there's very little discussion about global obligations and power relations between the global north and the global south. So elsewhere, we have the criminalization of knowledge. People are getting incarcerated for their knowledge claims. There's a massive, massive rise in anti-intellectualism, censorship, retaliation. There's an erosion of academic freedom. Look what's happened in Budapest. This week, the Central European University has had to relocate to Vienna. Okay, good, they've dealt with it. But Budapest was a strategically very important location for that university. It ran a massive program of Romani studies. It offered affirmative action to Roma students. It offered bursaries, mentorship, scholarship, etc. to Roma students, most of whom are based in Central and Eastern Europe. It's now coming to Vienna, which is a completely different political location. Okay, so there's a lot of movement now. And exile and displacement with academic colleagues around the world having to move and leave their countries, having to recalibrate their identities, recast their identities, often get re-credentialized. They can't just come and practice. If they're a doctor in Syria, they can't just come and practice as a doctor in Britain. They have to re-credentialize themselves. There's a lot of displacement going on. Many places, calls for democracy are coded up in medieval terms of sedition. And what is happening, I'm noticing with this bombardment of neoliberalism and threats and danger, is there's a kind of affective overload. There's only so much people can deal with. And it's back to that cognitive triage. There's all this horror going on around the world, but we look at our inbox and we deal with our emails because that's what's really urgent. Now, having said that, I don't want to end by leaving you all miserable and depressed and suicidal, etc. What I would like to just spend a couple of minutes on is looking at some of the kickback, the fight back, the resistance, and there has been plenty of it. So, for example, we've had a lot of opposition or industrial action. Look at the pensions crisis earlier this year. We've had opposition to student loans. We've had opposition to all kinds of unpleasant interventions. There are also alternative sites of higher education that are being developed. The Occupy movement, for example. The people's universities, in which academics from the mainstream go out into the community and give their time for nothing and deliver the same lectures to community organizations and groups. The massive, massive decolonization movement, we can't overlook that. And that, again, is a big global initiative. The Me Too, the Time's Up movement. Now, you could at this stage be saying, what's that got to do with neoliberalism? I'm sure you can work out the connections, but certainly as a late career academic, I have seen so many people, men, get away with this because they're being productive writers and their organizations need them for the RAE, the REF, whatever, and they've gone unpunished. And everybody knows that they're serial sexual harassers and no action has been taken because of their value within the neoliberal productivity system. But there's also another area, and this is the kind of denunciatory analysis, this ironic productivity of critical text. Now, we all know neoliberalism likes lots of outcomes. And what is ironic is that between the years 2002 and 2005, over 1,000 academic texts were produced critiquing neoliberalism. Okay, so I'm conscious now that I need to wrap up. And I expect at this stage you're all hoping for a what works slide. Let's have a taxonomy of do's and don'ts, some certainties, some exactitudes, something we can go away and put into practice. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm not from the Office for Students. I'm from a critical sociology centre, Cheer, in Sussex, and I'm going to keep being critical. And I would say, yes, we all know that we are constituted by discourse. We know that. The discourses speak us, as Foucault would say. But I'd like to think that there is some opportunity to move away from this sense that it's all determined. Now, I'm also aware that concepts like freedom, liberation, empowerment are enlightenment understandings. There is no space. There is no free space. We are invaded by discourse. But I would invite us, as a community of scholars, intellectuals, researchers, practitioners, thinkers, activists, to consider how can we trouble neoliberalism? Yeah. How can we show those colleagues in Gothenburg that we're not a load of cultural dopes that just accept everything that we're told? How can we expand the horizons of possibility and purpose of higher education? Can we try and fashion a new political imaginary that isn't all based on finance? Can we decommodify our social and intellectual imaginations? Most importantly, could we try and identify new discursive formations, lexicons, knowledge for imagining alternative higher education futures? Thank you very much.